There are moments that carve a scar so deep into your soul that nothing is ever the same again. For me, it was the night my mother died and the night my little sister and I lost far more than just her. What happened behind closed doors that evening has never been spoken out loud. Until now, my name is Anna Mae Whitmore. I'm 79 years old. A grandmother. A baker. A woman who learned to smile while carrying storms inside her chest. Today, for the first time, I will tell you the story that shaped my entire life. Please stay with me until the end. You may find that some silences are meant to be broken, especially the ones that hurt the most. The morning my life changed forever began with the sound of rain tapping against the tin roof. A slow, steady rhythm that seemed to echo the heavy sadness creeping into our small home. It was the spring of 1954, in the low fields of rural Alabama, where storms were as common as prayers whispered before every meal. The sky hung low and grey, the air thick with a damp chill that settled into your bones and stayed there. I remember standing barefoot on the porch, watching the muddy driveway turn into a shallow river, feeling something was wrong even before the day truly began. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke and bread that had gone cold, but there was something else too, a sharp, metallic scent that I couldn't place at the time, the kind that clung to sickness. When I peeked into my parents' bedroom, I found Mama lying still under the patchwork quilt, her skin pale and slick with sweat, her chest heaving as if each breath were a battle she was losing. Her lips, usually so quick to smile or scold, had a bluish tint that frightened me more than anything I had ever seen. I called out to her softly, "Mama." Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, filled with a pain that cut deeper than words. "Just a cold. Honey," she rasped. "Nothing to fret about." But even at 10 years old, I knew it was more than a cold. My little sister, Mary Beth, barely 6, clung to my skirt, sensing the terror in the room, though she didn't yet have the words to name it. Our father, a tall, quiet man named Jack Whitmore, stood at the foot of the bed, his face lined with worry. In one swift motion, he wrapped Mama in a blanket, lifted her into his arms like she weighed nothing at all, and told me in a voice that didn't leave room for argument, "Stay here with your sister. I'll get your mother to Fairhope." Fairhope was the nearest town with a hospital 30 long miles of winding dirt roads away. Before he left, he turned to my grandfather, who had moved in after my grandmother's passing the year before. "You keep an eye on them, Pa," Daddy said. Grandpa, sir, nodded, a solemn figure in his brown work overalls, a cigarette drooping from the corner of his mouth. He had always been a stern man, his kindness hidden beneath layers of roughness. At that moment, I clung to the idea that he would be enough to keep us safe. As Daddy carried Mama out the door, she lifted her head just enough to look back at us. Her eyes found mine deep blue, filled with so much love and fear and a silent apology. It was the last time I ever saw her alive. That image, the rain pouring down, her face framed by the grey light, burned itself into my memory so completely that even now, all these years later, I can see it as if it happened this morning. The truck's engine sputtered and roared to life, tires sliding in the mud as Daddy drove away. Mary Beth and I stood by the window long after they disappeared down the road, hoping somehow we had imagined the worst. But the house quickly grew too quiet, too hollow. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, but unsettles. I tried to busy myself, making a pot of oatmeal on the stove the way Mama taught me, but my hands trembled so much that half the oats spilled onto the floor. Grandpa sat in his chair by the fireplace, smoking and staring into the flames, saying nothing. Hours dragged by. The rain continued to fall, endless and heavy. Mary Beth sat on the floor with her battered cloth doll, combing its hair with trembling fingers. Every so often, she would look up at me with wide, frightened eyes, but I didn't know what to say to soothe her. I barely knew how to soothe myself. I read to her from our worn Bible, my voice quivering on every word, pretending everything was fine, because that's what Mama would have wanted. When the sun began to set, a thick, oppressive darkness settled over our home. The lamps cast long, uneasy shadows across the walls. I tucked Mary Beth into the small bed we shared. Smoothing her hair back and kissing her forehead, she asked me, in the softest voice, if Mama would be home by morning. I lied and said yes. Then I lay awake beside her, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the storm rage outside and wondering why the fear inside me felt even louder than the thunder. Grandpa moved around the house like a ghost, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. I caught him watching me once or twice, and each time, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather crept down my spine. But I told myself I was imagining things. After all, Grandpa had always been rough, but he was family. Family was supposed to protect you. As night deepened, a new sound joined the storm, the sound of wheels crunching gravel and mud. My heart leapt into my throat. I rushed to the window, praying it was Daddy's truck bringing Mama home. But when I saw the lone headlights and Daddy's silhouette alone in the rain, the last fragile thread of hope inside me snapped. Daddy came in soaked to the bone, his shoulders sagging under a weight no man should have to carry. Without a word, he removed his hat and held it tightly against his chest. The look in his eyes was enough to tell me the truth. Mama was gone. Forever. I wanted to scream, to crouch, to throw myself against the storm outside. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Mary Beth stirred beside me, sensing the sorrow, and I pulled her close, whispering empty reassurances into her hair. Grandpa stood silently by the hearth, his face unreadable. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer words. He simply stood there, as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. The house that had once been filled with Mama's laughter now felt like a tomb, and deep down, though I didn't know it yet, the real nightmare hadn't even begun. But no child can truly imagine how deep fear can go until the night falls. That night, after my father disappeared into his room, his sobs muffled by the thin walls, the house sank into a stillness so deep it felt unnatural. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my hands, trying to imagine a world without Mama in it. The rain had not stopped. It rattled against the windows like desperate fingers trying to get inside. Grandpa sat across from me, the lamplight carving deep shadows into the hard lines of his face. Without a word, he poured a measure of dark whiskey into a glass and pushed it across the table toward me. "Take it," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "It'll take the edge off." I hesitated. I had never tasted liquor before, and something inside me recoiled from it, but the pain inside my chest felt too big, too sharp, and when I looked into Grandpa's eyes, there was no gentleness, no patience, only an expectation that I would obey. My hand shook as I lifted the glass and took a tentative sip. It burned all the way down, bringing tears to my eyes. But Grandpa only nodded, poured me another, and waited. Grief blurred everything. It blurred the walls, the clock ticking on the mantel, the storm outside. It blurred my sense of time, of right and wrong, of myself. I drank because it made the ache inside me dull for a few moments. I drank because it felt like a bridge across a night I didn't know how to survive. Grandpa refilled my glass each time it emptied, his expression unreadable, almost patient, as if this were a lesson I was expected to learn. Eventually, the world around me tilted and swam. My head lolled on my neck like it no longer belonged to me. I barely registered it when Grandpa rose from his chair and came to my side. His large hand gripped my arm, rough and insistent. "Come on, now," he said. "Time to get some rest." I thought he was taking me to the room I shared with Mary Beth. I thought he would tuck me into bed and close the door behind him, maybe even pray over me the way Mama used to. But when we reached the narrow hallway, he turned toward his own room at the back of the house. My steps were clumsy, my body uncooperative. Somewhere inside, A voice screamed at me that this was wrong, that I needed to pull away, to run, but my mind was foggy, swimming, and all I could do was stumble after him. His room smelled of stale pipe smoke, sweat, and something sour beneath it all. The covers on the bed were thrown back, the sheets rumpled. He sat me down on the edge of the mattress, then knelt to remove my shoes, his hands lingering too long. Too close, I mumbled something, some feeble protest, but the words were slurred and lost. He told me it was all right, that I needed someone to take care of me now, that I was the woman of the house. His breath was hot and thick with whiskey as he leaned in closer. What happened next shattered my world in ways I didn't have the language to describe. His hands were everywhere, rough and merciless. I tried to push him away, but my arms felt like wet rags. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, just a thin whimper swallowed by the thunder outside. The pain was immediate and searing, a betrayal not just of my body, but of the very idea of safety, of family, of love. I closed my eyes tight, willing myself away, imagining I was somewhere else by the creek with Mary Beth, or in Mama's arms, or even just asleep, anything but here. At some point, I must have blacked out. When I woke, it was early morning, a grey, sickly light filtered through the curtains. I was back in the bed I shared with Mary Beth, who snored softly beside me, oblivious. For one blessed moment, I thought it had all been a terrible dream, but then the aches in my body made themselves known. I shifted and felt a sharp, raw pain between my legs. I sat up slowly, my nightgown twisted and stained. Looking down, I saw bruises already blooming along my arms, a smear of dried blood on my thighs. My stomach turned over, and I barely made it to the wash basin before retching up what little whiskey remained in my belly. I pressed a cold cloth against my face, trying to steady my breathing. My thoughts. The enormity of what had happened settled on me like a second skin tight, suffocating, inescapable. I had no words for it, no way to explain it, and worst of all, no one to tell. Daddy was broken by grief. Mary Beth was too young to understand. Who would believe a little girl against a respected old man like Grandpa? The thought of telling anyone was almost more terrifying than the thought of enduring it again. So I made a choice, one that no child should ever have to make. I swore to myself that I would stay silent, that I would bear it alone to protect my sister, to protect what was left of our family. I would smile when spoken to. I would do my chores. I would pretend nothing had changed, even though inside, everything had. That morning, as I buttoned up my dress with shaking hands and braided Mary Beth's hair like Mama used to, I became someone else, a girl who knew how to wear a mask so well that even those closest to her wouldn't see the cracks underneath. I thought it would end with me, but the darkness only spread wider. The days that followed blurred into one long stretch of fear and numbness. I moved through the house like a ghost, my body stiff and aching, my heart a stone in my chest. I learned quickly how to hide the bruises with long sleeves, how to explain away my winces with clumsy excuses. I learned to smile when spoken to nod when asked if everything was all right. At 10 years old, I became an expert in the art of survival, though each passing day chipped away another piece of the little girl I used to be. But the silent terror I lived with was nothing compared to the new fear that crept in once I realized Grandpa's eyes had shifted not just toward me, but toward Mary Beth. She was so small then, just 5 years old, with soft brown curls and a laugh that used to light up the room like a summer morning. In her innocence, she still trusted. She still believed that the world was good, that grown-ups were safe. Watching Grandpa watch her made something cold and violent rise up inside me, something I didn't yet have a name for. It started with little things. He would press a peppermint candy into her hand when Daddy wasn't looking. He would ruffle her hair, his touch lingering too long. He would offer to tell her stories on the porch swing, insisting she sit close beside him. To anyone else, It would have looked harmless, an old man doting on his granddaughter, but I saw the way his eyes darkened, the way his smile tightened when he looked at her. I knew the sickness inside him, and I knew where those small acts of kindness led. I tried everything I could think of to keep her away from him. I made up games for us to play in the back pasture, far from the house. I volunteered to do her chores. I told Daddy that Mary Beth was scared to sleep alone and convinced him to let us share a bed every night. I became her shadow, her protector, her second mother. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't be everywhere at once. One afternoon, the rain was falling in heavy sheets again. Drumming against the roof like an angry drumbeat, Daddy had gone into town for supplies, and I had been ordered to scrub the kitchen floors, a task that kept me on my knees, my back to the rest of the house. Mary Beth had been playing with her rag dolls in the living room, humming softly to herself. I glanced over my shoulder every few minutes to make sure she was still there, but at some point, as the mop moved back and forth over the cracked linoleum, I realized the house had fallen too quiet. I dropped the mop and ran. Calling her name, I found the living room empty, her dolls abandoned on the worn rug. Panic clutched my chest as I searched, the house suddenly too big, too full of dark corners and closed doors, and then I heard it, the soft, muffled sound of Mary Beth's voice behind Grandpa's closed bedroom door. At first, I thought she was talking to him, the way little ones do, but then the words became whimpers, then soft cries, barely louder than the sound of rain against the window panes. My legs locked beneath me, my fists clenched at my sides. Every instinct screamed at me to break down the door, to tear him away from her, to fight with everything I had. But I was just a child, thin and battered and terrified. Fear rooted me in place, as heavy and immovable as iron chains. I pressed my forehead against the cool wood of the door, biting down hard on my lip to keep from screaming. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to the sounds of my sister's confusion, her discomfort, her tiny voice pleading for him to stop. Minutes us hours. Time lost us all meaning. When the door finally creaked open, Grandpa emerged, adjusting his belt with a casualness that made bile rise in my throat. He looked down at me, and for one terrifying moment, I thought he might strike me. Or worse, but he only smirked and walked away, disappearing into the kitchen as if nothing had happened. Inside, Mary Beth sat on the edge of Grandpa's bed, her dress rumpled, her face wet with tears. She clutched her favorite doll to her chest like a shield. When she saw me, she gave a small, broken cry and threw herself into my arms. I held her tight, tighter than I ever had before, and whispered lies into her ear, soothing words I didn't believe. It's okay. It's over. I'm here. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot, and it wasn't okay. That night, as I watched Mary Beth drift into a fitful sleep beside me, her small hands still clutching my nightgown, the crushing weight of guilt nearly suffocated me. I had failed her. I had sworn to protect her. And when it mattered most, I hadn't been strong enough. The guilt gnawed at me in the dark, sharper than any physical pain. I hated myself for my fear, for my weakness, for every second I stood frozen outside that door while she cried for someone, anyone, to save her. Lying there in the darkness, I made another silent vow. If I had to become stone, if I had to become ice, if I had to fight with every breath in my body, I would never let him touch her again. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know what it would cost me. But that night, something inside me hardened into steel. What he did to me was evil. What he did to her shattered something deeper. Here's the full writing for 4, The Days of Endless Winter, following all your detailed instructions. Slow, richly emotional, vivid, no icons, no unnecessary line breaks, and word count indicated at the end. Winter that year came early and stayed long, as if the earth itself refused to thaw after everything we had lost. Cold seeped into every corner of our little house, not just through the cracks in the walls or the worn seams around the windows, but into the very air between us. Grief hung heavy like the frost that clung stubbornly to the fields outside, a frozen silence broken only by the crackling of the fire or the occasional creak of old wood contracting against the chill. We lived in that silence, my sister and I, side by side, but each trapped within our own walls of fear. The house, once filled with the smells of Mama's baking and the soft hum of her voice, had become a place where laughter was a foreign sound, where even breathing felt like a risk. Daddy worked himself to exhaustion trying to fill the emptiness she left behind. He rose before the sun and returned after it had long since disappeared beyond the horizon, his face drawn and hollow, his hands raw and cracked from the fields and the cold. He spoke little and saw less, missing the signs that to me screamed louder than any words ever could. He didn't notice the way Rosie flinched when Grandpa came too near. He didn't hear her muffled cries at night when the nightmares tore her from sleep. He didn't see how she started biting her nails until they bled, or how she shrank into herself, as if trying to disappear altogether. I saw it. I saw everything, and it broke me a little more each day. Rosie was changing. My bright, fearless little sister who once danced barefoot in the summer fields, who once sang to the birds and carried worms in her pockets, was folding inward like a flower dying in the frost. She clung to me at night, waking me with her small hands shaking my shoulders, her face streaked with silent tears. Unable to say what terror haunted her dreams, I held her tight, rocking her back and forth the way Mama used to do, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "You're safe," I lied, over and over again. "You're safe." But we weren't safe, not really, not while Grandpa still sat at the head of the table with those cold, calculating eyes, not while he moved through the house with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who believed he owned everything and everyone inside it. His presence tightened around us day by day like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter. He controlled when we ate, when we worked, when we played, when we slept. Daddy, lost in his sorrow, seemed to see only a grateful father filling the void Mama had left behind. But I knew better. I saw the hunger in Grandpa's gaze, the possessiveness when he looked at Rosie, the warning in the way he would glance at me if he thought I might speak. I couldn't protect Daddy from his grief, but I could protect Rosie. I began to plan, carefully, quietly. I never let Rosie be alone with him if I could help it. I would volunteer to do every chore that might separate us. If Grandpa sent Rosie to the cellar to fetch something, I found a reason to go first. If he called her to sit with him on the porch, I suddenly needed her help inside. I pretended to be clumsy, knocking things over so that she would stay close. I made a game of hiding in the barn loft together, pretending we were pioneers hiding from bandits, when really I was hiding her from a much closer danger. It wasn't always enough. There were still moments, small cracks when he would find her alone. Even just for a minute, every time I found her safe, I felt a rush of relief so fierce it left me dizzy. Every time she cried at night, I hated myself a little more for not being able to stop whatever visions haunted her. I prayed harder than I ever had, bargaining with a God I barely understood. Let her be safe. Let me take it all if that's the price. Just don't let him touch her again. Hope, once a warm and shining thing inside me, began to wither like the frostbitten cornfields outside our window. The weight of fear was a constant ache in my chest. Some nights I would press my hand over my heart, just to make sure it was still beating beneath all that cold. I watched Daddy carefully, desperate for any sign that he might see what I could not say aloud. Sometimes, late at night, I caught him looking at us, at Rosie curled against me, at the tension that never left my shoulders, but his eyes would quickly cloud over again, retreating into the endless fog of his own sorrow. He wanted so badly to believe that life could be normal again, that we could somehow stitch ourselves back together. I didn't have the heart to shatter that fragile hope, even if it meant sacrificing mine. And so the days dragged on, heavy and slow, each one a mirror of the last. I learned to live in the spaces between fear, finding tiny moments of safety like rare drops of rain in a drought, a smile from Rosie when she thought no one was looking, a day when Grandpa left us mostly alone, a night when the nightmares didn't come, small mercies, not nearly enough, but all we had. I lost count of the prayers whispered into my pillow. I lost count of the promises I made in the darkness. I lost pieces of myself, chipped away day after day, until the girl I had been before Mama died felt like a stranger I only met in dreams. And still, deep down, some stubborn flicker of hope refused to die completely, because even the longest, darkest winter must eventually give way to spring. Even the heaviest clouds must one day part to reveal a sliver of light. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I clung to that belief with everything I had. Until one day, the shadows shifted and a small crack of light appeared, with the final word count marked at the end. It was early spring when Aunt Edna came to visit, arriving in a swirl of dust and the scent of lilacs from the old scarf she wore wound tightly around her neck. She wasn't really our aunt, not by blood, but an old family friend who had known Mama since they were little girls, running barefoot through the meadows. Aunt Edna was sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, the kind of woman who could peel the varnish off a lie with just a single glance. She stepped through the door, brushing mud from her shoes, and the house seemed to hold its breath. She was supposed to stay for just a weekend, to help Daddy get back on his feet, to ease the burden that had settled on our house like a heavy woolen blanket. Daddy welcomed her with a tired smile and a grateful hug, barely managing to conceal the exhaustion etched into his face. Grandpa offered a stiff nod, as if the mere presence of another adult in the house was a disturbance he would tolerate but not welcome. It didn't take Aunt Edna long to notice what others had ignored. She sat quietly through dinner that first night, her sharp gaze flickering from me to Rosie, from Grandpa to Daddy, reading the silences between our words. The way Rosie flinched when Grandpa's hand moved too suddenly. The way I kept myself positioned between them at every opportunity. "These children are too quiet," she said softly later that evening, standing on the porch with Daddy after the dishes had been cleared. "Their eyes are too old." I heard her through the screen door, her voice carrying just enough to reach my ears, but not meant for me. Children their age should laugh more, shouldn't look like they're waiting for the next blow. Daddy sighed, the sound heavy with defeat. "It's been a hard year. Edna, they lost their mama. It's natural." But Aunt Edna didn't look convinced. She knew grief. Everyone did in a town that small. But she also knew fear when she saw it. And she had seen it that evening in Rosie's trembling hands, in the tightness of my jaw, in the way Grandpa's eyes never strayed far from either of us, even when pretending disinterest. Grandpa was clever, though he masked his true nature when others were around, slipping easily into the role of the grieving patriarch. He poured Aunt Edna coffee, fetched her coat from the rack with exaggerated courtesy, even offered to fix the broken hinge on her car door. To anyone looking from the outside, he was a tired old man, doing his best to hold a broken family together. But when Aunt Edna looked at me across the dinner table, I saw the questions simmering behind her gaze. She found small excuses to speak to me alone, fetching laundry from the line, peeling potatoes for supper, walking out to the chicken coop in the early morning mist. She never asked outright, perhaps sensing that a direct question would drive me deeper into my shell. Instead, she wove her concern into a casual conversations. "You holding up all right?" "Anna May," she asked one afternoon as we gathered eggs. "You and Rosie?" "Yes, ma'am," I answered automatically, my voice flat and practiced. I didn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on the smooth, fragile shells in my hands. I knew better than to let down my guard. The cost of telling the truth seemed too high, too dangerous. The last thing I wanted was to draw attention to Rosie, to make things worse. Aunt Edna nodded slowly, not pressing, but I could feel her watching me, as if waiting for a crack to show in the mask I wore so tightly. I didn't give her one. Not then. Rosie was clinging tighter to me with each passing day. She would hide behind my skirts when Grandpa entered a room, her little fingers digging into the fabric as if she could anchor herself to safety through me. At night, she curled against me like a baby animal seeking warmth and protection. Her nightmares were more frequent, and sometimes she would cry out Mama's name in her sleep, her voice raw with need. I soothed her the best I could, whispering the same empty promises over and over again. But inside, I was unraveling. Every look, every touch from Grandpa made my skin crawl. Every smile he offered in front of others felt like a twisted joke. Yet somehow, Aunt Edna's presence, even for just those few days, felt like a lifeline I hadn't realized I was reaching for. Someone had seen us, someone had noticed, and even if I couldn't say the words aloud, even if I couldn't bring myself to shatter the fragile facade holding our family together, a seed had been planted. Aunt Edna might not have known the whole truth, but she knew enough to be suspicious, enough to start asking the kinds of questions that couldn't be easily dismissed, enough to make Grandpa nervous in a way I had never seen before. And once suspicion takes root, it becomes harder to hide the rot. The sky that afternoon was the color of old bruises, thick with the promise of a storm. I was in the kitchen, peeling potatoes with Rosie perched silently at the table. When I heard the rattle of the old truck coming up the drive, it was too early for Daddy to be home. He was supposed to be at the hardware store in town, running errands. Not back until after supper. My hands froze on the peeler. Rosie looked up at me with wide, uncertain eyes. Before I could move, before I could shout for her to stay close, Grandpa was there in the doorway. He moved with a kind of slithering smoothness that always set my teeth on edge. He smiled that twisted smile of his and called Rosie's name in a voice too sweet, too patient. "Come here. Little bird, I've got a surprise for you out in the shed." Rosie shrank back against the table, clutching the hem of my apron with trembling fingers. "No," I whispered, shaking my head at her, willing her to stay where she was. But she was only 5, too young to resist the command of an elder. Grandpa stepped into the room, reaching for her with a hand that had already stolen so much from both of us. I stepped between them, but he shoved me aside easily, like a rag doll, and grasped Rosie's wrist. The kitchen door slammed open with a crack like gunfire. Daddy stood there, dripping wet from the storm, his coat clinging to him, his eyes locking instantly onto the scene before him, the terror on Rosie's face, the cruel grip of Grandpa's hand around her fragile arm. For a second, time seemed to hang suspended, a breath held by the whole universe. "What are you doing?" Daddy's voice was low. "Dangerous." A growl from deep in his chest. Grandpa dropped Rosie's hand as if it had burned him and took a step back. "Nothing, son. Just playing with the little ones. They're scared of the storm. That's all." But the lie didn't have time to settle. Rosie, bless her tiny heart, ran straight into Daddy's legs, sobbing, burying her face in his coat, and in that single, shattering moment, Daddy understood everything he hadn't let himself see. The confrontation exploded without warning. Daddy lunged across the kitchen, his fist colliding with Grandpa's chest, knocking him backward. Years of suppressed grief, of trust betrayed, of guilt for not seeing sooner, fueled his rage. Dishes crashed to the floor. The table was shoved aside, chairs toppling with a clatter. Grandpa fought back at first, cursing and swinging his arms wildly. But Daddy was younger, stronger, fueled by a fury that would not be contained. Grandpa stumbled, his foot catching on the worn rug in front of the stove. For a moment, he flailed in the air like a man trying to grab onto nothing. Then he fell backward, his head striking the heavy cast-iron edge of the wood stove with a sickening crack. The sound silenced everything the storm outside. The pounding of my heart. Even Rosie's sobs. Grandpa didn't move. Blood pooled slowly beneath his head. A dark, spreading stain against the wooden floorboards. Daddy stood there, panting, his fists still clenched, staring down at the body of his own father. A terrible, heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the frantic hammering of rain against the windows. I grabbed Rosie and held her tight, shielding her face, shielding her from the sight, even though the worst of the damage had already been done. The monster was defeated, but victory tasted like ashes in my mouth. Grandpa's death wasn't a triumph. It was a wound that cut even deeper than the ones he had inflicted. We had survived. Yes, but at a terrible cost. Daddy sank to his knees beside Grandpa's body, pressing 2 fingers to the old man's throat, searching for a pulse he must have known he would not find. Slowly, he turned to look at me. His face was wet, though I couldn't tell if it was rain or tears. "Get your brother," he said hoarsely. "Tell him we have to stick to the story. Tell him he didn't hear anything." I nodded, mute, already feeling the heavy weight of a new kind of silence settling over us. The kind of silence that saves you in the moment, but chains you forever afterward. As I helped Rosie to her feet and led her to the hallway, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. We had won our freedom. But the price of that freedom was a secret that would bind us tighter than any chain. Survival always demands a price, and the silence demanded even more. The story we told the sheriff was simple and clean, the kind that small towns like ours preferred. An accident. Plain and tragic. Grandpa had been drinking, lost his footing on the slick floor near the stove, and fell. The doctor, a kind man who had treated us for coughs and fevers over the years, nodded sympathetically and signed the papers without asking hard questions. Death by misadventure. They called it a tragic household accident. No one looked too closely. No one wanted to. In a place like Wilkins County, Alabama, people understood that some truths only tore families apart and served no good. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Tom McCaskill, who had known my father since they were boys, pulled Daddy aside after the examination. I remember watching from the hallway, seeing them talk in low, measured voices, their faces grave under the weak porch light. When Daddy came back inside, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing while the rain whispered against the windows. Later, years later, I understood Sheriff McCaskill had seen enough to guess the real story, but chose to let it lie buried with the body. In those days, scandal was something folks feared more than quiet injustice. Better, they thought, to protect the living than to stir up shame for the dead. Grandpa's funeral was held 3 days later, under a sky as grey and heavy as a stone. There was no grand service, no eulogy sung with trembling voices, just a plain pine coffin, a handful of acquaintances nodding stiffly by the grave, and the thin voice of the preacher reading from a psalm about the valley of the shadow of death. No one wept, no one clutched at the casket as it was lowered into the wet earth. My father stood stiff and silent, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Rosie held my hand tightly, her small fingers cold and trembling in mine. She was too little to understand fully what had happened, but even she could feel that the world had shifted, that something dark had been exorcised from our home. After the last handful of dirt was tossed onto the coffin, people began drifting away without the usual lingering. No casseroles were delivered to our doorstep. No neighbors stayed to reminisce about the deceased's better days. Grandpa's life ended without ceremony, without grief. It was as if the whole town had silently agreed that some men deserved to pass from memory as quickly as from breath. As we climbed into Daddy's battered truck, the windshield blurred by a steady drizzle, none of us spoke. We didn't need to. A new chapter had begun, one that would be written in careful silences and guarded glances. That night, long after Rosie had fallen into a troubled sleep, Daddy and I sat at the kitchen table once more, the same place where so much horror had begun. The oil lamp cast a soft, flickering light across his worn face. He looked older than his 34 years, the weight of guilt and sorrow pressing down on him. He poured 2 cups of coffee, even though I was far too young for it, and pushed one toward me with a shaking hand. I wrapped my fingers around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into my cold skin. "We're going to be all right. Anna May," he said after a long silence. His voice was rough, hollowed out by everything he had lost and everything he had done. "But you and I, we need to keep this between us, for Rosie's sake, for our family's sake." I nodded. There were no tears left in me, only a dull, throbbing ache. I knew, even then, that secrets had a way of burrowing into the soul, twisting things inside. But what choice did we have? Telling the truth would tear us apart. Better, my father believed, to bury it with the man who had caused it. Rosie never asked many questions. She was too little to grasp the complexities, though she must have felt the undercurrent of change. She clung to me more tightly at night, waking often from nightmares she couldn't put into words. I would pull her close, whispering nonsense lullabies into her hair, promising her in the dark that we were safe now, that the monster couldn't hurt us anymore. But some part of me wondered whether she would always carry the ghost of those terrors, whether they had already carved scars into her that no one could see. The house itself felt different. It still smelled of wood smoke and old books, of baking bread and damp earth. But the air was lighter, less oppressive. There were no more sudden, heavy footsteps in the hallway, no more lingering stares that made my skin crawl. Still, the shadows lingered, clinging to corners and creeping into dreams. Freedom had come at a price. We were no longer prisoners. But we were not entirely whole either. We were free to rebuild. Yes, but we were also bound together by a shared guilt, a pact sealed with blood and silence. Freedom came wrapped in guilt and grief, tangled like vines around the heart, reminding me every day that survival sometimes demands sacrifices you carry forever. It was Aunt Edna who finally offered us a way out, her voice steady and warm one evening, when she sat across from Daddy at the kitchen table. "Come to Fairhope," she said. "Start fresh." Her house wasn't large, but it sat on a quiet street, shaded by old magnolia trees, and there was a good school within walking distance. Daddy hesitated, his hands clenching and unclenching as he stared into his coffee cup. But in the end, he agreed. The thought of staying in the house where so many memories, both sweet and sour, clung to the walls like mildew was too much for all of us. We packed only what we needed: clothes, a few precious books, the photo of Mama that hung above the mantel, and we left Wilkins County behind before the winter frost melted from the fields. The house in Fairhope was smaller and smelled of lemons and old wood. Aunt Edna had embroidered curtains at every window, and a garden crowded with marigolds and tomatoes. Rosie and I shared a small room painted pale yellow. It was strange at first, sleeping in a place where no ghosts waited behind doors, where the night sounds were only the croak of frogs and the soft sigh of the trees. I started school a few days after we arrived. Clutching a lunch pail Aunt Edna had scrubbed clean, its paint chipped and faded but still sturdy. The other children, polished and neat, eyed me curiously. I smiled when necessary, answered politely when called upon, but kept most of myself tucked away, hidden behind careful eyes. Rosie, too young for school yet, spent her mornings in the garden with Aunt Edna, her laughter cautious at first, like a bird testing its wings. Rosie's recovery was slower than mine. Though in truth, neither of us healed in straight lines. She clung to me more fiercely than ever, her small hand constantly finding mine, even in sleep. She would startle at sudden noises, wake from naps crying for Mama. I wrapped myself around her like a second skin, determined to be the shield she needed. I watched over her at night, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her bed whenever the nightmares returned, whispering stories into the dark about safe places and strong mothers and sisters who never let go. It wasn't enough to erase what had been done, but it was something. It was a start. Daddy tried, in his way, to knit us back together. It didn't come easily to him. Tenderness was not a language he spoke fluently, but there were small things: a patched doll for Rosie's birthday, a clumsy bookshelf he built for my growing collection of hand-me-down novels, the way he would sometimes sit quietly with us in the evening, humming old hymns under his breath. He enrolled me in piano lessons at the church, though money was tight. "Your mama loved music," he said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "Thought maybe you might too." It was in those small, careful gestures that I saw the man who had fought for us, not with words or grand speeches, but with calloused hands and a heart too battered to speak its pain aloud. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend easily, but day by day, moment by moment, we stitched ourselves back together. Aunt Edna's patient guidance, Daddy's steady presence, Rosie's quiet bravery, all these were threads in the fabric of our healing. I learned to laugh again, haltingly at first. Like a rusted gate swinging open, Rosie began to sing to herself while playing, a soft, tuneless hum that filled the house with a fragile, aching beauty. We planted a garden in the spring, and every tomato that ripened, every marigold that bloomed felt like a defiant act against the sorrow that had once defined us. Still, the nights held their shadows. The nightmares did not vanish all at once. There were nights when I woke to the sound of my own voice crying out, when the weight of old fear pressed against my chest so hard I couldn't breathe. There were nights when Rosie crawled into my bed, shivering, and we clung to each other until dawn. But those nights grew fewer as the seasons turned. The edges of the fear dulled. Like a knife worn down by years of use, we learned that healing wasn't forgetting. Healing was living anyway, carrying the past without letting it define every step forward. And yet, some ghosts refused to stay buried forever. Even as we built our new lives, brick by careful brick, I could feel the tremors of something still buried deep, waiting for its moment to rise. The teenage years crept in like a slow, heavy fog, and with them came an invisible wall that separated me from the world. While other girls laughed in clusters at the school gate, compared lipstick shades, and dreamed of summer dances, I sat quietly by the window, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my eyes turned inward. I learned how to fade into the background, how to become the kind of girl teachers didn't call on and boys didn't tease or flirt with. Safety came at the cost of loneliness, but loneliness was a pain I understood, a pain I could control. I watched life from a careful distance, never letting it get close enough to hurt me again. Rosie, though, grew up differently. Somehow, the pieces of her heart had not been shattered in the same way. By the time she was 12, she had a circle of friends who adored her, a quick smile that could light up a room, and a spirit that refused to be caged. She danced barefoot in the yard on warm summer evenings and painted her dreams onto scraps of old newspaper Aunt Edna saved for her. Watching her was like witnessing a miracle I didn't know how to reach. I loved her fiercely, protectively, but I could never quite follow her into that bright, open world. I remained cautious, like a bird with a broken wing that had healed crooked, never trusting the sky again. It was Aunt Edna who first dared to dream beyond the ruins we had survived. She was a practical woman, but there was a fire in her that hard years had not managed to quench. One afternoon, sitting on the porch while the cicadas buzzed lazily in the trees, she turned to me and said, "Anna May, surviving isn't the same as living. Don't let him steal any more from you than he already did." Her words stunned me. No one had ever spoken so plainly before. I looked down at my hands, at the small white scar near my thumb, where a splinter from the old porch railing had once embedded itself. Surviving was all I knew. Dreaming of more felt dangerous, almost like tempting fate, but Aunt Edna wasn't finished. "You're smart," she said, tapping the side of her head. "You've got a mind meant for more than hiding. Your mama would have wanted you to live, really live." She didn't press. She just let the words hang there, like seeds waiting for a crack in the soil. One night, Months later, when the weight of unspoken things felt too heavy to carry alone any longer, I told her everything. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where so much fear had once sat like an invisible guest between us. The clock ticked in the corner, and the sweet smell of cornbread cooling on the counter filled the air. My voice trembled at first, but once the words started, they poured out like a river breaking through a dam about Grandpa, about Rosie, about the silent terror that had shaped every breath I took. Aunt Edna listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly on the table, her face still and grave. When I finally ran out of words, when the kitchen fell into a heavy, aching silence, she reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was firm, steady, anchoring me to the moment. "I believe you," she said simply, no questioning, no doubting, no asking why I hadn't spoken sooner, just belief, solid and immovable, a gift more precious than anything I had ever received. In that moment, something inside me cracked, not in the way that breaks you, but in the way that lets the light seep in. For the first time, I began to understand that it hadn't been my fault. None of it had. I wasn't to blame for the darkness that had been forced upon us. Rosie wasn't to blame for the nightmares that still haunted her. The guilt I had worn like a second skin for so many years began, ever so slightly, to loosen its hold. I saw myself not as a broken thing, but as a survivor, a girl who had been forced to carry too much, too young, and who had somehow managed to endure. It was not a magical transformation. Healing does not come in flashes of brilliance, but in the slow, painful process of relearning trust, of daring to believe in kindness again. I started with small things, walking home from school with my head held a little higher, raising my hand once in a while in class when I knew the answer, accepting the invitation to a church social. Even though every nerve in my body screamed at me to stay hidden, each step was tiny, almost imperceptible to anyone but me. But together they stitched a fragile new fabric over the torn places inside, and as I inched forward, the world inched back toward me. I began to see that life, for all its cruelty, still had beauty in it, sunsets bleeding gold across the sky, Rosie's laughter floating up like a song, Aunt Edna's fierce hugs that squeezed all the broken pieces together for a while. Slowly, inch by inch, light began to seep back in. There's a special kind of victory that comes not with parades or loud applause, but in quiet, steady steps toward a life once thought impossible. For me, that triumph began when I became a teacher. It still feels like a miracle, standing in front of a classroom after everything that had happened. Every time I wrote a word on the chalkboard, helped a small hand hold a pencil the right way, or read a story aloud while the children listened with wide eyes, I was reclaiming the very ground where I had once been broken. Those early days were hard. There were mornings when fear sat heavy on my chest for no reason I could name. But somehow, standing among those young faces, their hope and laughter like small beams of light, I found the courage to be more than the broken girl I once was. I was becoming the woman my mother would have wanted me to be, the woman my little sister needed me to be. Rosie, too, grew into her own kind of fierce beauty. After everything we endured, it would have been easy for her to become brittle, angry at the world, but instead, she found a strength that was wild and unstoppable. As she grew older, her laugh became louder, her steps more certain. She spoke her mind without hesitation and defended the vulnerable without fear. Watching her was like watching a young tree that had been bent by storms grow tall and straight. Roots deep in the ground, she went on to study nursing, pouring her compassion into caring for others. Every time I saw her walk into a hospital room with her shoulders square and her eyes kind, I knew the monster had not won. We had. Dad found his own way toward peace, though it took time and quiet suffering. After moving to a new town with Aunt Edna's help, he tried to build a life that honored both my mother's memory and the future he wanted for us. He planted a small orchard behind our house, tending the trees with the kind of devotion that only a grieving heart can understand. He rarely spoke about the past, but in his actions, the care he took with Rosie's schoolwork, the small wooden toys he carved for neighbor children, the way he always made sure the house felt safe and warm, you could see the penance he offered the world. When he passed away, it was a gentle departure. In his sleep, after an afternoon spent pruning his favorite peach tree, standing by his grave, with Rosie at my side and the orchard in full bloom behind us, I realized he had found his own kind of forgiveness, and in doing so, he had given me permission to seek mine. It was years later, after college and the early years of my teaching career, that I met Daniel. He was unlike any man I had ever known, soft-spoken, wasn't, carrying a quiet sadness of his own. At first, I kept him at a distance, too afraid of what love could demand, but Daniel was in no hurry. He brought me coffee without asking, listened without trying to fix what he did not understand, sat beside me in silence when the old fears rose up like ghosts, slowly, almost imperceptibly. He taught me that love could be a shelter, not a trap. It was Daniel who showed me that tenderness need not come wrapped in threats, that a hand held out to you could mean comfort, not control. The night I allowed him to hold me without flinching, without fear, was not marked by fireworks or dramatic declarations. It was quiet, simple, and, for me, revolutionary. Together, we built a home where silence had no power. Our children, a boy and a girl, grew up knowing that no question was too dangerous to ask, no story too dark to be listened to. We taught them early that truth was never something to be ashamed of, and that their voices mattered. Laughter lived in our walls. Forgiveness sat easily at our table. When nightmares sometimes found me even years later, I would wake to find Daniel's steady hand in mine, or my daughter's tiny arms wrapped around my neck, whispering, "It's okay. Mama, you're safe." In those moments, I knew that we had broken the cycle. We had not just survived, we had rebuilt, with walls of kindness and a roof of honesty. Looking back now, I see that this was the true legacy we built, not one of pain or fear, but of fierce hope. We taught our children, and now our grandchildren, that it is possible to face even the deepest darkness and still choose light. We showed them that even the worst beginnings do not have to dictate the ending, that you can take the shattered pieces of your life and build something stronger than you ever thought possible, that healing is not forgetting, it's remembering with compassion for the wounded child you once were, and forging forward anyway. And that sometimes, the greatest triumphs happen not with grand gestures, but with small, stubborn acts of love and faith, repeated day after day after day. And now, sitting here with the weight of years behind me, I finally understand. There are days when the past feels like a distant storm, rumbling far beyond the hills, no longer able to touch you but never quite forgotten. I sit on my porch now, an old woman whose bones remember every winter, every sorrow, every quiet victory. The air smells of fresh earth and rain, and I watch the sun settle behind the pines with a heart both heavy and light. For a long time, I believed the wounds would define me, that the broken child I had been, shivering in silence, would always be the truest thing about me. But I was wrong. Life, in its stubbornness, finds ways to bloom even in soil soaked with grief and fear. It sends up fragile shoots through cracks you thought would only ever bleed. It reminds you, in small, steady ways, that healing is not forgetting, it is carrying. It is transforming. It is enduring. I learned that surviving isn't a grand gesture, a single triumphant day where pain is banished. It is the quiet morning you get out of bed, even though the dreams tried to drag you down. It is the tender smile you give your child when the past whispers that trust is dangerous. It is sitting with the memories without letting them dictate your future. And it is learning that you can be both the wound and the healer. If you are listening to my voice now, And your heart carries scars invisible to those around you. Know this: you are not broken. You are not less because you hurt. Every breath you have taken, despite the weight pressing on your chest, is a triumph no one can steal from you. Your pain does not shrink you, it deepens you. It teaches you to see other people's sorrows with clearer eyes. And it binds you to every soul who has ever walked through fire and kept going. If you ever find yourself lost in the long night of your grief, remember, morning always comes. Not always quickly, not always easily, but it comes. You have strength waiting inside you, coiled like a seed under frozen ground, ready to break open at the first hint of light. You are braver than your worst memories, stronger than the hands that tried to hurt you, and infinitely more precious than you have ever been told. Your story is not finished. Every moment you choose hope, every time you dare to laugh, to trust, to dream, you are writing new pages with a hand steady from survival. If my story touched something in you, please do not let silence win. Share your story in the comments, with a friend, or even whispered alone in the safety of your own room. Every voice that rises breaks another brick from the walls that try to keep us isolated. And if you can, share this message of hope, subscribe, like, or simply pass it on to someone whose hands are trembling with a weight they think they must carry alone. Together, even with nothing but our quiet truths, we can be the light that breaks through someone else's darkest night.